fact it was. Well, my friends, I say this to you. Yes, things might have been worse. But on the other hand, remember that things might have been a whole lot better.
Nation is in difficulty. Not permanent difficulty. Temporary. Surely temporary.
Wir haben nun in Paris und London und New York
I'm on my way from Detroit, the historic capital of the automobile age, to a lesser-known shrine in the nearby town of Dearborn in Michigan. I'm going to visit a museum built there over 50 years ago by that technical pioneer and entrepreneurial genius, the first Henry Ford. Dearborn was the scene on October the 21st, 1929, of one of the most extravagant of all celebrations of American enterprise. It's an appropriate place to begin the story of the Great Depression of the 1930s, because the magnificent party Mr. Ford threw there marked a turning point in the history of our century. It marked the end of an era which had made the United States by far the richest nation on earth, and it was held just a few days before the American economy collapsed. That collapse led to what was to become the greatest depression in the history of the world. As the train pulled into Dearborn that October afternoon, it was met by a galaxy of the most distinguished and powerful people in America. They'd been invited by the great automobile magnate himself, Henry Ford, and they'd gathered here on the station platform to welcome the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, and the guest of honor at the celebrations, Mr. Thomas Alva Edison. Edison was honored as a great American who had, during his long life, put a brilliant scientific mind to practical and profitable use. 50 years previously, he'd invented the electric light bulb. His companies, which now generated cheap electrical power across the American continent, had helped to create the industrial boom that had lasted throughout the Roaring Twenties. That morning, the people of Detroit had their opportunity to demonstrate their faith in American business, and in its favorite son, Herbert Hoover, as he passed through Detroit on his way to Dearborn. In spite of the rain, tens of thousands of newly affluent car workers and their wives and children lined the streets of the city, waving and cheering along the 4-mile route of the presidential journey. President Hoover also came to Dearborn to hear what America's industrialists had planned for the future. Behind closed doors, with film cameras and the gentlemen of the press excluded from the celebration dinner, Hoover listened intently as his host explained his strategy. Henry Ford told his guests that he was going to Americanize the world. He was exporting his mass production techniques to Europe and multiplying his own fortune by repeating his American successes in every country on earth. A new Ford factory was soon to open in Cologne in Germany. That summer, his son Edsel Ford would soon cut the first turf on a greenfield site in Dagenham, England, where Ford cars would be pouring off a brand new assembly line. Henry Ford's confidence in the future of American capitalism went down very well here in Dearborn. There was a stream of speeches in the same vein from the assembled financiers and other dignitaries. Many of them added that their corporations, too, were now looking for new business worlds to conquer abroad. None of them seemed to doubt that free enterprise capitalism would go on from triumph to triumph for many years to come. After the speeches were over, observers predicted that when news of these ambitious projects reached New York, the stock market would soar even higher. There would be plenty of time, they took it for granted on that 21st of October, for the benefits of the great stock market bonanza to spread wider still and wider. A mere 3 days after those exhilarating festivities here in Dearborn, that vision of unending abundance was brutally exposed as an illusion by what happened on Wall Street in downtown Manhattan. On October the 24th, 1929, Black Thursday as it became known, the New York Stock Exchange was the scene of the greatest financial panic ever known. On that day, the phenomenal boom in share prices, which had lasted throughout the bull market of the later 1920s, finally burst. The great crash had begun. After a quiet opening on the exchange that day, prices started to fall by mid-morning. The stock market seemed to be suffering a temporary correction, but orders to sell continued to pour into brokers from all over the country. What had started as a routine, if depressing, market fluctuation rapidly degenerated into a mad scramble to sell while stocks still had any value to salvage. As news spread from Wall Street, panic and fear gripped investors as they watched the abrupt reversal in their fortunes. Day after day, almost for as long as any of them had ever owned a bond or a share, the market had gone up, bringing profits to everyone. Now in brokers' offices, banks and boardrooms all over America, the ticker tape which constantly punched out the latest stock prices in New York reported a horrific story. On that day, a record 13 million shares changed hands at prices which wiped out in an instant not just the profits chalked up in happier times, but most of the savings of the unlucky investors. Not all investors, however, lost everything on Black Thursday. At a crisis meeting, New York's most powerful bankers agreed on a plan to staunch the financial hemorrhage. They decided to give a clear signal that prices wouldn't be allowed to fall any further. That signal was the appearance, at 1:30 in the afternoon, of the mighty J.P. Morgan Bank's own floor trader, the best-known figure on the stock exchange, Richard Whitney. He marched to the post where steel shares were traded. Brokers watched open-mouthed as he gave his order. I buy steel. He bought 10,000 shares for almost $30 million. Then he did this again and again, buying shares in different companies until the panic selling stopped. The day was saved. Over the weekend, however, with the stock exchange closed, investors across the country reflected on the market's prospects and decided that the time had come to get out. On Monday, heavy selling lasted throughout the day, with large falls in prices, and with all eyes focused again on the bankers. It seems that many of the bankers themselves were in the red, having borrowed heavily to speculate on shares, and the shares had now fallen sharply in value. They seem to have agreed that the public's desire to sell was so strong that they couldn't hope to prevent the market reflecting this widespread collapse in confidence. So the scene was set for what's now known as Black Tuesday, the day that brought the great crash to its climax. Black Tuesday has passed into legend. That was the day the earthquake struck the capitalist system. The stories of ruined speculators plunging in despair from the windows of New York skyscrapers are the stuff of myth. But the pain and suffering the crash caused for hundreds of thousands of impoverished investors were real enough. Some financial celebrities bankrupted by the crash did in fact later resort to pearl-handled revolvers in hotel bedrooms. But most of the misery was endured stoically by anonymous, once well-to-do Americans who had been tempted to gamble in the speculative frenzy and had lost their life savings. For on Black Tuesday, October the 29th, 1929, $25 billion were wiped off the value of American securities as the bottom fell out of the market. A lot of people lost a great deal of money in a very short time. But that's not why the Wall Street crash deserves its place in history. Its real significance lies in the fact that it triggered off a chain of economic disasters, which led to a far more terrible and more universal event, the greatest economic depression in history. It wasted the lives of countless millions of individual men, women, and children. It produced cataclysmic transformations in the life of the world. In the end, it was only cured by the even more terrible cataclysm of war. In the United States, which we will focus on in this first program of our series, the Depression virtually brought economic life to a standstill. Within 3 years, some 15 million people were thrown out of work. The Depression then spread like a plague to the rest of the world, where a further 30 million were forced into the dole queues. In Germany, where its effects were exceptionally severe, it set off a wild orgy of nationalism, which first destroyed Germany's fragile experiment in democracy, and then unleashed the political upheavals that led to the Second World War. Today, once again, we live in a climate of economic failure and fear. People ask themselves, could it happen again? And so it's both natural and wise to go back and look once again at the Great Depression of 50 years ago and to ask, why did it happen? What lessons does it hold for us today? The Roaring '20s was the most prosperous decade in American history. In the 7 years to 1929, the country enjoyed phenomenal economic growth. The production engineers were turning new technologies into new industries. The most important of the new mass production industries was this: the seemingly insatiable demand for cars brought fortunes to those Detroit magnates, like Henry Ford, who'd introduced mass assembly line production. In 1919, the most basic car, this Model T, could be bought only by the relatively rich. By 1926, the price had fallen, and almost every family owned a car. Mass ownership of the motor car revolutionized the American way of life. It kicked off a gigantic boom in the construction industry as new roads were built, fanning out from city centers to the country. People deserted the crowded tenements of the city centers. They headed out to the new suburbs, where they could have spacious houses with a garden and a garage. Once they'd moved to the suburbs, the typical middle-class family equipped the new home with a range of newfangled gadgets. This consumer revolution meant big profits for the manufacturing companies and for those corporations which provided all the other services the new lifestyle required. By 1928, Americans were enjoying a standard of living scarcely dreamt of by previous generations. President Hoover, in the election campaign of that year, captured the mood of America and coasted to victory on the promise of 4 more years of prosperity. By the end of the 1920s, then, America's economy put her head and shoulders above the rest of the world. But this prosperity was built on sand. The technology of production had far outstripped the technology of finance. Capitalism has always been about borrowing and lending. But in the 1920s, as mass production surged ahead, the borrowing pyramided to unprecedented heights. For the first time in history, tens of millions of people found they had money left in their pay packets after buying the necessities of life. Few of them had enough left to buy the new cars and other tempting gadgets outright, but they did have enough to meet the interest payments if they borrowed the money. Lending by the banks and finance houses grew to enable people to buy the growing output of the factories. The economy boomed because For the first time, large numbers of people were able to buy on what was called the never-never, the sort of thing that in the past only the rich could afford.
It wasn't just domestic appliances that people bought on credit. The housing boom, too, was financed by borrowed money. To enable the city centre tenement dwellers of 1920 to become the smart suburbanites of 1929, the massive issue of mortgage debt had been necessary. These mortgages were not, however, like the 25-year mortgages we're used to today. They were promised for around 5 years, which meant that at the end of that short term, the homeowner had to seek a new mortgage. Farmers, too, were eager to get a share of the new prosperity, even if that meant buying on credit. Most American farms were in fact bought on mortgages, and it was common for a farmer to take out a second mortgage to buy the latest agricultural machinery. It wasn't just individuals who were borrowing. Corporations were borrowing and building. And so were states and cities and towns. And of course the get-rich-quick mania on Wall Street, which had created an insatiable demand for company shares, had tempted thousands of corporations to finance expansion by issuing stock at almost any price they chose. Investors, meanwhile, were also borrowing to enable them to buy those company shares or government bonds, all of which seemed certain to rise in value. The investors had borrowed from stockbrokers, who had themselves borrowed from the banks and from other financial institutions.
America's prosperity, therefore, rested on a mountain of debt which rose higher and higher as the decade wore on. As long as everyone was earning enough to meet the payments on their debts, there was no need to worry. But if for any reason optimism about the economy were to vanish and incomes began to fall, then there was obviously the danger of a wild scramble to get out of debt. To avoid bankruptcy, people would desperately try to sell off the stocks, bonds, and other assets they'd borrowed money to buy. That's what the economists call a liquidity crisis. If that happened, the people with the most liquid funds, that's hard cash, wouldn't want to lend it to speculators who were already deep in debt. But if the speculators were left to go bankrupt, then they would pull down their creditors with them. A chain reaction could begin. One after another, all the borrowers and all the lenders might go bankrupt, until in the end, even the most cautious banker would find that he could no longer meet his obligations. For all the confidence that Henry Ford and his friends showed at their Dearborn celebrations, the fact was that something had already happened in the American economy which deeply disturbed some investors here on Wall Street. Signs had already begun to appear that the great consumer boom of the 1920s was beginning to run out of steam. These investors were afraid that if the boom did end, people might find they could no longer meet the interest payments on their debts. If that happened, they reckoned the stage would be set for spectacular financial collapse.
The boundless optimism of Henry Ford and the other American business leaders was already proving to be unjustified even before their grand celebration at Dearborn. Ford had launched his Model A car in December 1927, pouring 800,000 cars off his assembly lines in the first 5 months of 1929, just as the automobile market was reaching its saturation point. Although the Model A established itself as the country's best seller, it didn't do as well as Ford had expected, and thousands had to be stockpiled at the dealers. What sales there were of the Model A, however, were achieved at the expense of the other models on the market. With high investment continuing in 1928, the companies needed to sell an even greater number in 1929 for that investment to be profitable. When, in fact, the cars piled up unsold, it was clear, at least to those not blinded by the euphoria on Wall Street, that profits were bound to fall. As sales fell, the companies were forced to cut back. Assembly lines were closed, and workers temporarily laid off. The car industry had entered a recession because the high investment in the industry in the late 1920s meant that the number of cars produced greatly exceeded the demand in 1929. The recession had been caused by what economists call overinvestment. Overinvestment also struck other key industries, like construction and consumer goods. The result was a nationwide wave of layoffs and sackings.
Half a century after the Great Depression, economists are still deeply divided, as we shall see, over precisely why it happened and why it persisted for so long. But there is a consensus among them that it started with a recession in the very industries that had led the boom in the 1920s: cars, construction, and what are called consumer durables. In those days, radios, fridges, and other electric appliances. A fairly normal business cycle recession was turned into the Great Depression by the dangerously unstable structure of debt which had been built up in the prosperous 1920s. This particular scenario of collapse is known to economists as debt deflation. Debt deflation took place in every sector of the economy between 1929 and 1933, but nowhere more catastrophically than right here on Wall Street in the stock market. Once investors realized that sales and profits in those key industries were falling, they decided that the inflated share prices could no longer be justified, so they ordered their brokers to start selling. That's what started the financial panic on Black Thursday, October the 24th, 1929. The Great Crash was a product of mob psychology. Once some investors, reacting to the downturn in the economy, had given their orders to sell, fear spread across the market like a fire. As prices fell, everyone tried to turn his assets into cash. There's what's known as a crisis of liquidity. Investors who'd borrowed to speculate had their loans called in by the brokers. The brokers, in turn, had borrowed from the banks. Share prices fell through the floor. The speculators could no longer honor their debts, so they brought their creditors into bankruptcy as well. Panic broke out right here on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Those black days shocked the entire country. They gave rise to a pervasive fear about the future health of American business. That fear, in turn, induced further retrenchment in every significant sector in the economy.
Manufacturers immediately slowed down production in anticipation of a further fall in consumption. It was the new industries, such as automobiles and home appliances, which suffered the sharpest declines. For manufacturers knew that in hard times, it was easier for people to postpone purchases of luxuries like cars or fridges. As a direct result of these cutbacks in industry, unemployment doubled to 2 million between the Wall Street crash and the spring of 1930. This rise in unemployment gave a further twist to the downward economic spiral. For as people lost their jobs or were threatened with imminent unemployment, they reduced their spending. Shops and department stores tried desperately to boost their sales early in 1930, but the spenders failed to appear. The wealthy, who had been hit hardest by the crash, cut their purchases drastically. Virtually the whole of the population tried to save as much as possible to meet mortgage and other debt payments. Less spending further depressed the economy. Manufacturers, too, tried to economize to prevent collapse. Burdened with heavy debts, and now in 1930, facing a precipitous drop in demand, they sold off their existing stocks. They cut back on production and on investment. They laid off workers in larger and larger numbers. By the summer of 1930, unemployment had climbed to over 4.25 million. Virtually every family in the country now got a taste of what depression meant.
I took him washings and fed the whole 11. He got down sick on me. And so I fed the whole 11 with washings that I done. And I'd go clean up anybody's house. Then I cleaned one lady's house. I cleaned her house for a quarter a day. You know, work hard, clean that 4-room house and clean 4 porches, make up her beds and everything for one little quarter. That was hard money.
I worked one whole summer. This man had 2 teams of mules, and we'd hook up about 6 o'clock of the morning, and 11 o'clock we'd on harness, take the mules to the barn, water them, and at 1 o'clock we'd go back and hook up, and at 5 o'clock that evening we'd quit for the night. And I got 50 cents.
My father lost his job. We had a third mortgage on the house. We had tenants upstairs, but every year these tenants would move out because they couldn't afford to pay the rent, even though it was only $25 or $30 a month. They got together with, mother would get together with the daughter, or sisters and brothers would get together. So out of one apartment, 2 families lived in. And every year when a tenant moved out, we had to pay before we get another tenant in. So whatever income was there wasn't enough to pay the mortgage, interest on the mortgage, and taxes, and water bills.
Oh, I was unemployed for almost 4 or 5 years, I would say. I wouldn't say completely. I always managed to get an odd job. Sometimes when somebody came along, I went out to the other neighborhoods. We used to hang awnings up around springtime when they used to take the awnings out of the cellar, and we used to hang the awnings up. Then, naturally, what I would do is I would take out a horse and wagon and peddle fruit. And then sometimes there was a time when I would go out and get a couple of cases of eggs and go from house to house selling eggs.
American farmers were especially badly hit. They hadn't shared in the boom of the 1920s. Farm prices had been low for 10 years. By 1930, more and more farmers were unable to keep up their mortgages. Many went bankrupt. Thousands were evicted and their farms put up for sale. Some of those who didn't lose their farms were still so angry that they preferred to waste their produce rather than accept derisory prices.
The collapse of the American economy into the Great Depression didn't happen all at once. We've seen that it started off with a recession in a number of key industries: cars, consumer goods, and construction. This downturn was enough to trigger a fall in incomes and prices, which exposed all the weaknesses of the economy's debt structure. As more and more businesses and individuals tried to sell off their assets for cash to meet their obligations, this only forced prices lower and ground more of the helpless into bankruptcy. The psychological effect of widespread deflation was to make people hold off spending. That made the plight of business even worse. The result was a virtual collapse in manufacturing, agriculture, and finance. But worse still was to follow. The next link to give in this chain of economic woe was the country's banking system.
America's banking system was totally unprepared for the series of shocks it received in the Depression years. The system itself was vulnerable because it was made up of about 25,000 individual banks, most of them small, and dependent on either one industry or one locality for their prosperity. If that industry or that area should for any reason see its fortunes dwindle, the bank was liable to find itself in difficulties as well. This is exactly what happened in the United States in 1930. Their troubles first became evident in the rural states like Nebraska, where agriculture was the basic industry. When the farmers began to default on their payments to the banks, a crisis developed. Anxious depositors, afraid that the bank would fail and that they would lose their deposits, besieged the banks in an effort to withdraw their savings. If these small rural banks had belonged to an integrated banking system in which branches could turn to a head office for help, it wouldn't have happened. But with nowhere to turn for emergency loans, many of them simply collapsed under the pressure. Over 5,000 banks went broke in the United States between 1930 and 1933. And the closures were not confined to the rural states, for many of the failures were medium-sized city banks, which had lent money to banks in the agricultural regions. It's estimated that $7 billion, or 15% of all the banking deposits in American banks, were wiped out between 1930 and 1933, when over one-fifth of the commercial banks suspended operations.
The bank failures brought great hardship to the thousands of depositors who couldn't get their money out before the banks closed their doors. But for one school of economists, the bank closures have a far greater significance. Monetarists maintain that these bank failures caused a sharp decline in the supply of money in the economy. It was this sudden drop in the money supply, they say, that was responsible for the fall in national income. The reason the banks collapsed, say the monetarists, was the failure of the Federal Reserve Board, roughly the American equivalent of the Bank of England, to provide the banks with as much money as they needed to avert the crisis. The Federal Reserve's policy mistakes, they say, were the ultimate cause of the Great Depression. This monetarist explanation has recently been critically examined by a number of economists. They've found that it doesn't hold water. It's true, as the monetarists claim, that the money supply did fall between late 1929 and late 1930. But prices fell over 3 times as fast. In real terms, therefore, the money supply actually rose. If the money supply really had contracted, say the monetarist critics, then short-term interest rates would have risen sharply. In fact, they fell steadily from the stock market crash until the autumn of 1931. The bank failures then were probably not the fundamental cause of the Great Depression. The partial collapse of the banking system was simultaneously a consequence of the Depression and something which, once the Depression had started, made it even worse.
The economy was collapsing. Unemployment spread like an epidemic. By 1932, the number out of work had risen to 15 million. In big cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, it was the unskilled, the young school leavers, the blacks, and the old who suffered the most. Many were sacked, to be replaced by child labor on a scale that had not been seen for 30 years. The once well-to-do members of the middle classes suffered as well. They lost their jobs, their savings, and in some cases their homes. As finance companies refused to refinance their mortgages, they went bankrupt. Some of the very people who'd escaped to the prosperous suburbs in the 1920s now found themselves back in the city, on the sidewalks, and in the soup lines. The Chicago Tribune's popular cartoon strip, Little Orphan Annie, drawn in the depths of the Depression, tore at the heartstrings of America. Annie and her once prosperous father had been evicted from their opulent mansion and had rented a couple of rooms in a squalid tenement.
I can't even be a janitor or a street cleaner. I've tried, no chance. I applied at a dozen different places for a job as a clerk or a bookkeeper. If they even listen to me at all, they tell me I'm too old. Well, I feel old tonight at that. But I'll keep at it. I won't give up. I'll land a job tomorrow.
American society was peculiarly ill-equipped to deal with the calamity that the Depression brought. The traditional attitude to the unemployed poor man was that he was responsible for his own misfortune. If he was destitute, he ought to place himself in the debt of one or other of the private charities. Unemployment was seen as a personal failing, and there was no recognition of the responsibility of the state to provide for the unemployed man's needs, much less of his right to demand government assistance. Before the crash, unemployment in America was very low, and private provision for the unemployed, though Spartan and patchy, did provide relief for the destitute. If a man had no job, he was expected to sell what valuables he had before turning to charity for help.
So it was a very tough struggle that went on for quite a while for a working class family, not only working class, but lower middle class and even other middle class family, to try to get enough to feed the family, to pay the rent, and do simple things of that kind.
this family upstairs, they had 4 children and 1 on the way, and they were really down and out. The husband, he went out looking for a job. He couldn't find any job. So he used up all his savings to feed a family of 4. His wife was expecting the 5th child, and they had to do so. The people next door, there was a teacher living, and encouraged them. As a matter of fact, being that they didn't speak well English, she took them to this place where they could apply for a little help. They didn't know what it meant. It meant that they would give her a paper with her name and where to go 1 day of the week. And on the paper it said this was a family of 6 people and they need food. So they would give her a bag with potatoes, onions, and the basic things. And they told her that that had to last for the whole week. And it was never enough.
Almost every neighborhood had an unemployed council, because every neighborhood there was a great mass of people who were unemployed and who would die of need. So when an eviction came along, naturally, there's children out on the street. And that's what I meant, that people had compassion for one another. We couldn't see people out on the street that way. And what we did after the marshals went away, and it was nighttime, and there was no place for these people to sleep, we gathered together a good number of people, maybe about 50 or 100, whatever, how many we could, and each one of them picked up a piece of the furniture and we carried it right back. And they went back into the place.
Towards the end of 1930, a campaign was launched to protest about the conditions the unemployed had to endure, and to demand that the federal government accept responsibility for their fate. A key demand of the Unemployed Association was the introduction of a dole, a system of payments to the jobless, like that which existed in Britain. The protest march, which attracted 100,000 unemployed people, ended in a rally in Union Square in New York on December the 6th, 1930. One of the leading organizers of the march was Herbert Benjamin.
Well, the conditions of the country at the time were intolerable insofar as the not only unemployment was, but the unrelieved state in which the unemployed were left. The federal government completely disregarded and ignored the needs of the unemployed, with Mr. Hoover, the president, refusing point blank to provide any relief at all, considering that not to be a problem of the federal government, and denying, in fact, there was very much unemployment. The president lied, deliberately lied, I think, because he believed that this was psychologically necessary in order to avoid creating a greater panic, and in order to comfort and in order to reassure the American public. But actually, it was the policy of the American ruling class to reassure the people. The Chamber of Commerce, for example, sent out a questionnaire to its branches, asking them what can be done to help in the depression. And the reply of a great majority of them was, stop talking about unemployment. Don't say anything about there being unemployed in our cities. And then we will have less unemployment. They thought that they would reduce unemployment if they talked less about it.
A self-made millionaire himself, Hoover was deeply committed to the free enterprise system. He believed it was the basis of America's traditional liberties and had been the source of her previous prosperity.
I assure you that this country is not to blame for the catastrophes that have come to the world. The American people did not American people did not originate the old world age controversies of Europe. We did not inaugurate the Great War or the panics that have taken place in the last 5 years.
Hoover clung to his faith that the free enterprise system would recover from the Depression. As a traditional Republican, he also believed that government only undermined free enterprise. The Depression, in Hoover's view, was a hiccup in the steady growth of American affluence, a temporary recession which market forces would inevitably cure. The federal government mustn't interfere. Recovery would be left to businessmen, who should be encouraged.
Is that we are convinced that we have overcome the major financial crisis, a crisis in severity unparalleled in the history of the world, and that with its relaxation, confidence and hope have reappeared in the world. The great war against depression is being fought on many fronts in many parts of the world. One of the most stupendous actions of the front, the great front, has been the long battle of the last 18 months to carry our financial structure safely through the worldwide collapse.
Hoover opposed a congressional plan to set up a $100 million dole fund. He thought government handouts to the unemployed only destroyed their self-reliance. Dole money was an English disease, which had made its British victims feckless and utterly dependent on the state. Hoover's political authority ebbed away during 1932, as the recovery so often promised failed to materialize. Attacks on the president grew more and more strident on Capitol Hill. And all over America, the frustration and the bitterness boiled over into numerous violent protests. This resentment increasingly concentrated on the industrial magnates and financiers who'd promised so much only a few years earlier. One of the ugliest outbreaks of industrial violence occurred, ironically, at the site of the lavish celebration in October 1929, the Ford Motor Company's factory at Dearborn, Michigan. In March 1932, 3,000 unemployed men, many of them Henry Ford's former employees, marched peacefully to Dearborn.
It was like a picnic. It was a big joke. They were going to play a big joke on Henry Ford. Well, when we got to the city line, after we had finished our march, you mean to Dearborn, the line, that's when the thing began. When we got to the Dearborn line, they called a halt there to wait for the pass to come, the permit to come. It was supposed to be brought up by the Dearborn police. And there was a conference. And it was during the discussion of that as to what to do that a few filtered across the line. You know, just a few. And that was a scene, because we didn't know what was behind it. They were waiting for anything just to put across the line. And a few filtered, and the next thing we knew, they were slugging. And when they started slugging, we started slugging. Everybody did. And then the battle was on. And as the police retreated and as we fought them on down the line, got closer and closer, then the machine gun bullets started. Then policemen began going every which way, and we were left exposed to the darn thing. See? The police didn't fire on us. They fought with us with their fists, but they didn't fire on us. The firing took place by Henry Ford's guards. And so we hit the ground, and Bustle, my friend, we got separated. He saw the police slugging some women, or police or guards, or whatever the heck it was. He rushed over to where they were to help. And I could see him, and I was telling him to, come by as much as I could do, because I was really terrified of the whole thing, see. He was torn between, it seems he was torn between coming back where we were and going where he saw this thing happening. And when he got near it, he turned. That's why they got him in back. He veered away from it. I don't know why. Who knows who does what or why. And they shot him in the back.
The Dearborn killings and many other violent episodes at industrial plants across America helped to poison the political atmosphere in the country. And 1932 was an election year. President Hoover's political support began to disintegrate as his policies, or more accurately perhaps his exhortations to businessmen, failed to stop the economic collapse. By the spring of 1932, even Republicans in Congress who'd stayed loyal since his inauguration were now publicly attacking him. Hoover defiantly stuck to his view that his job was to create a climate of confidence in which entrepreneurs would again flourish and lead the economy back to health. Nothing did more to undermine Hoover's political credibility, though, or to prevent a recovery in business confidence, than the president's handling of what was known as the bonus army. These were old soldiers who'd marched to Washington to petition Hoover for government relief.
After America's victory in the First World War, the Congress had voted the nation's appreciation to the ex-servicemen by awarding each of them a sum of money which would be paid in 1939. Some former soldiers decided that they would never need that money more than they did in 1932, when the Great Depression was at its worst. And so the bonus marchers gathered in Washington to demand immediate payment. Impoverished but good-humored, they pitched their tents on the outskirts of Washington at Anacostia Flats.
It was a very polyglot group of men. Some had their old uniforms, lots of them, and their shoes were worn out, and they were just hungry and thin when they arrived. They had to depend upon people to give them food. And the chief of police of Washington, D.C., was General Glassford. He'd been a friend of them, and he took their side and allowed them to build these little shanties on the Anacostia River there in the flat. And they built them out of old packing boxes and corrugated iron. The name of the street's after battles they'd been in, which gave it a kind of historic touch. Some had their wives and babies with them. They had no sewage, and the river was stagnant and muddy at times when it rained, and then it was dust after that, and it was overcrowded. Worse than the battlefield. It smelled worse than the battlefield. And the smoke from the campfires would blow up Pennsylvania Avenue across the White House, and President Hoover, who'd shut himself in, he was told that they were there to capture Washington, and he actually believed it. So he called out General MacArthur, who'd been the general over some of these men, and Eisenhower, who later became president, and General Patton. Those three men, think of it, three top leading American generals were given the job of driving those veterans that they'd commanded out of the city. And they drove them into Maryland. And it was a horrible thing when they had to go on foot and scramble their way away from this gas. The cavalry, had a troop of cavalry, 6 tanks, and a big column of soldiers from Fort Myer. And they just suddenly closed in and threw the gas.
In spite of the outrage over Hoover's treatment of the bonus army and the increasingly violent industrial protests all over the country, America in 1932 was by no means in a revolutionary mood. The president's political authority had reached rock bottom, yet he had no doubt about his ability to crush any violent protest that might occur. As for the campaign for federal unemployment relief, it was a total failure. The protest failed partly because of police harassment, and partly because of the weakness of organized labor. Most of all, though, they failed because of the apathy, the sense of helplessness, which people felt when they faced the economic collapse. President Hoover went into the election campaign of 1932 promising yet again that recovery was just around the corner. The president's faith in his policies was so strong that in spite of his failure to end the worst depression in American history, he promised to continue those same policies for 4 more years.
We, all of us, are struggling to reduce the cost of government. We're struggling to avoid national and state and municipal borrowings. Our tax revenues have greatly diminished. We must find new tax revenues to supplement those sources which have been dried up by the Depression, so far as our deficits cannot be made up by drastic reductions of expenditures. We must resolutely balance our budgets. With the utmost care that can be exercised by the executive officers and the legislators throughout the nation, and with the utmost goodwill, it is bound to cause individual hardship and to grieve the friends of many worthy causes. Nevertheless,
Hoover's renomination was a godsend to the Democrats, for they were in the process of choosing as their presidential candidate a man who'd made his reputation as governor of New York by his compassionate treatment of the unemployed.
We had a real cause. We had a cause in which we believed that the country was not only interested, but a cause on which the future of the country very greatly depended.
The Democratic candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a charismatic gentleman from one of New York's great families, who'd overcome the handicap of near-total paralysis from polio by sheer willpower. He now promised a vigorous, nationwide policy of intervention by the federal government to bring the Depression to an end. He promised salvation, and what's more, he promised it with a certain style and wit.
You've been told that things may be worse if I'm elected to office. Well, my friends, I say this to you. Yes, things might have been worse. But on the other hand, remember that things might have been a whole lot better.
Thomas Corcoran worked for Hoover until he was converted by Roosevelt.
You want to remember that at that time, this country was in an individual sense, in a very desperate state. There, after the crash in the stock market, which kept on going through 32, there were no jobs. Very important men were out selling apples. Now, the people had lost all faith in Mr. Hoover's government, and they lost all faith in the state government. And this fellow comes up and says, in a beautiful voice and in a beautiful speech, "You have nothing to fear. I will take command if necessary, as if I were a dictator. Now I'll take care of you." People in desperate situations want somebody to tell them what to do.
Smiling, confident, and immensely popular, Roosevelt kept up a ferocious attack on the Hoover administration throughout the election campaign. Wherever he went, he inspired hope. And when he won an easy victory in November, it was no surprise.
4 months later, when he was sworn into office, the Depression had the entire free world in its grip. In Europe, it had created havoc. Only 2 months before, it had propelled Adolf Hitler to power in Germany. Already, it had brutally demonstrated that Britain was no longer an economic superpower. Here in America, the Great Depression put a question mark over the future of capitalism itself. It undermined for 2 generations the idea that the free enterprise system could automatically guarantee growing prosperity for all Americans. For the next 50 years, there was a consensus here in Washington that the risk of searing hardship that went with the traditional laissez-faire economics was politically unacceptable. Only now, in the 1980s, has that consensus been seriously challenged.